And so when we look at that idea as it relates to the metabolic rate issues, and this goes into, okay, how do we take those modifiable factors and stick them into my metabolic rate? This is where we have our non-modifiable factors, our weight, our height, our age,
Right.
and then our modifiable factors, which in the equation here that we tend to use, which is the Benedict equation, where we have this factor known as the ACF, the activity conversion factor. And what the
Okay.
activity conversion factor is doing is it's saying, okay, how much more energy do you need beyond the 100% that you normally need just to have your heartbeat and your neurons work and your kidneys function and your liver
Yeah, and
function,
all the basic
all the basic
stuff.
functions.
Yeah.
How much more energy do you need in a day?
Right.
And so all of those, how much more energy I need in a day comes back to what is happening in terms of my body composition, what is happening in terms of my physical activity, what's happening in terms of my health status. And this
Right.
is where for the longest period of time, we used to think of fat tissue as not metabolically active, not providing any additional metabolism into what's going on.
Right.
But we've realized that that's not the case. And
Right.
so there's multiple equations that we look at as it relates to the metabolic rate. And so one of the things that comes out when we start looking at the issues of metabolic rate and weight is this old, and I like to use this as old, thought process. And the old thought process is that in order to maintain balance in terms of weight, I have to maintain calorie balance. And that is
Exactly.
however many calories I intake has to be equal to the amount of calories that I use in a day.
Yes.
But that always leads to a rhetorical question that I ask every physiology student that I come across, anybody who I talk to about this whole issue. How much does a calorie weigh?
No idea.
Well, that's a very good response, because here's the thing: calories don't weigh anything. Calories have no weight to them. And I
Yeah,
know that calories.
that's where my question with the fat came in, because I'm like, then how much does a calorie weigh if I'm
Yep.
consuming, like a cookie that's this tiny, but it's
Mhm.
like 500 calories? Where's all that coming from?
Yep. And so that's where it's like, how much does a calorie weigh? And a calorie doesn't have weight to it. And so since a calorie doesn't have weight to it, to utilize that idea as a caloric balance it's a misnomer. It's taking us in the wrong direction. It's not really a logical fallacy. It's just not pointing us in the right direction, which takes us to a true false question that we always have to address here when we start looking at the balance issues and metabolism. And that is where people automatically think that being thin means having a fast metabolism.
Yes.
And that's false. Just because you're thin, just because you're fat, however you want to reference those terms, doesn't directly indicate whether you have a fast metabolism or a slow metabolism. That's because what we're talking about in terms of metabolism is simply all those chemical reactions that are taking place in the body.
Right.
We can increase our metabolism, we can speed up our metabolism by increasing the amount of physical activity we have in a day.
Right.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that I have a fast metabolism. It simply means that I have a faster metabolism than I had when I was at rest.
Right.
And so when we think about it, the next question that usually comes is, what do you mean there is no such thing as fast metabolism or slow metabolism? I look at these images and I look at these pictures where I have the overfat person and the fit person.
Right.
And there has to be a difference. There has to
Yeah.
be a difference. There has to be a difference. There has to be something to explain why someone doesn't have a lot of body fat and someone has a lot of body fat.
Right.
And it's not about metabolic rate, regardless of what people say. Once again, logical fallacy when we say people say.
Yeah.
And so
Exactly.
and so 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 ad populism.
I was gonna
For those
say
of you
ad
that remember
populace.
for those of you who remember your logical fallacies, the ad populism statement of, well, people say that there is this thing. It's a non sequitur. It's taking us off
Track.
track. Or people say, oh well, my son eats these bags of potato chips and doesn't seem to gain a weight. Doesn't seem to gain any weight.
Yeah. I've heard that
Okay.
one a lot.
Yeah.
A lot.
how much mass is in a bag of potato chips?
Not much. It's
There's
mostly
not.
air.
Yeah, a lot of what we see in a bag of potato chips is air. Most of the potato chips that are sold in the stores are usually about 800 grams,
Mm-hmm.
less than a kilogram
Right.
of mass. And so if I am normally metabolically active, and a lot of people talk about this are usually talking about teenagers,
Right.
and teenagers tend to have a very high metabolic rate because of all the growth that's taking place and all the physiological responses that's taking place
Oh, that's
due to
true. I didn't
pubertal
even think of that.
changes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they need all that because they're in the middle of growing. That
Ex-
makes so much more sense. Oh my God.
exactly. And so one of the things that you can always do for people who are listening that have young children or children who are going to go through growth spurts. When I'm going through a growth spurt, before I go through a growth spurt, I'm going to start to eat more. And the
Yes.
reason I'm going to start eating more is because I'm getting signals that head upstairs into the hypothalamus and into the areas that are going to regulate my hunger drive that say, you need to eat, you need to eat, you need to eat. And so one of the things that happens prior to most growth spurts is that I'm going to put on some adipose tissue.
Right.
Put on some adipose tissue so that I have additional fuel sources available to me so that when I'm growing, I can take the things that I need to grow, and we'll get to those lists here in a few minutes. I have those sources for growth available to me to grow, and I'm not going to use them to meet my energy demands. I have the other things that are available for me to meet my energy demands. That doesn't mean that as I'm putting on adipose tissue, my metabolism is slowing down. It simply means that I'm
Right.
sending out hormonal signals that say, hey, we need to store stuff for later use.
Right.
And so one of the things we now have to remember is that, okay, calorie in, calorie out, it's a fallacy. It's an illogical argument in terms of that. So what should we be looking at? Well, why should we not use the calorie in, calorie out? There's a host of reasons. And the principal number one reason is that the BMR equations are not accurate. They're accurate to a certain extent. And they're accurate to the population that was used to determine the equation.
Okay, that
And
makes
for all of
sense.
us who understand the history of medical research and the history of who gets put into these survey studies to determine all of
Right.
these regression equations, automatically know the issue here. And the issue is that who was used to make the models?
People?
Young people were, males,
Oh, okay.
European descent.
Ah, so we have
Because most
one control or one study group, one
base
population.
one population, and what happens is that because it was generalizable to European descent individuals, it then got generalized to population as a whole. But what's happened recently, and I'll put some of the references into the notes here in terms of where you can find the other equations. What's
Right.
happened recently is that we found out that those equations do not hold true, even though we have a female equation for
Right.
females across all populations. It doesn't hold true for the indigenous populations, regardless of which indigenous population we're talking about. It
Right.
doesn't hold true for anybody of African descent. So,
That's
so,
most of
so,
the world.
so there's a lot of the world where we're not using an accurate estimate to determine what is the metabolic rate that's taking place.
So is that why I read in that you can take certain people, so if they're suffering from obesity or some type of, overfat issue, and you put them on an indigenous Hawaiian diet, so what their ancestors theoretically would have ate when they got to Hawaii, it helped them lose a bunch of weight. Is that relating kind of to this, where you need to base it kind of off your descent somewhat?
To a certain extent, yes. There's
Okay.
a couple issues with that, and but as it relates specifically to metabolic rates, what we're looking at here is we're looking at the fact that the equations that we use are referred to as regression equations. So we take all of these factors come into play and we figure, okay, how much correlation is this providing? How much correlation is this providing? How much correlation is this providing? We then toss it into a scatter plot. We look at, okay, what is the linear line that gets developed based off of where all the points line up.
Right.
And that's how we develop the equations, whether it's the McCardle equation or the Benedict equation or any of the other equations that relate to metabolic rate.
Right.
The other problem with that calorie in, calorie out, fast metabolism, slow metabolism, is that everything is an estimate.
Right. Yeah.
Even what we consume is an estimate. Unless you're going to sit there and actually weigh out what was actually in the food that you're consuming.
Yeah. It's a rough guess.
It's a rough guess. It's a rough estimate. Unless you're going to do direct calorie measurements of heat being produced by your body during exercise or during physical activity, what you use in a day is a very rough estimate.
Right.
Even if I ignore the equations for a second here.
That's
But the
true.
other problem with that calorie in, calorie out issue is that the principal assumption is that everything that I consume as a nutrient is automatically going to be used for energy purposes.
Oh, that's true.
Which means that I'm not having any nutrients available if I'm a teenager or if I'm
Mm-hmm.
an infant or if I'm a toddler for growing or
Exactly.
if I'm older to keep my body from completely deteriorating into nothing.
Right.
And so one of the things that we have to take into account here is the fact that it should never be about calorie in, calorie out. It should be more about what nutrients am I taking in, and then what nutrients am I utilizing in order to be able to maintain all of the tissues of my body.
Okay.
And this is where we get into there are slight metabolic differences that take place based off of how I eat, but there is a generality that we have as it relates to the nutrient consumption.